In this video, we're going to cover crimping of the 9mm rounds that we've now successfully seated bullets in. We're going to advance the die set to the crimp die. Now, the crimp die is similar to the bullet seating die in that there's an adjusting knob on the top that does all of the work. Now, historically, crimping's actually been done with the bullet seating die. This device on the top is, if you'll recall the settings, we backed this out so there was no contact with the case, and we used this knob on the top to adjust the level of the depth of the mandrel that actually pushes the bullet into the case. Historically, what you would do then is to back this back out so that it no longer contacts the bullet, because you don't want to insert it any deeper once you have the final depth correct. So you'd back this out of the way, and then you would slowly advance the body of the die itself until it came in contact with the case mouth, and then advancing that slightly would impart the crimp to the case. My problem with this is that it's very imprecise, and one of the reasons it's imprecise, in fairness, is that there's still a lot of debate over what is exactly a technically correct amount of crimp depending on the bullet, the load, and the situation. If you think about it, there's only two reasons you want to crimp a bullet in the first place, crimp the case in the first place. One of them is you want to prevent bullet creep, which would be the bullet moving in or out of the case itself, especially in response to recoil. If it was a round in a firearm that was not being discharged, the recoil from the one that was being discharged could move that bullet either further in or further out, which could cause jamming if it was further out. It could cause increases in pressures if it was further in. There are even cases where they have vibrated completely out and dumped powder into the magazine of the firearm. I prefer the newer crimp-only dies where that's all it does. You have the ability to adjust this for very precise measurements. You can then test the amount of crimp, which we'll go over in the next video, and if it's sufficient, you're done. But it's extremely accurate in terms of being able to set up, and especially in terms of being able to document what your setting was and being able to duplicate it. The way this one is set up is you put the die in and you advance it until your ram just touches the die body, and then snug it down, and then you back out this adjusting knob on the top, and you put a round in the case. Now, this is a little bit tricky because this body is doing one other thing. It's doing a final sizing of the completed finished round, much like you would have with these cartridge checker type devices. This one is by Lyman and has all of the more popular handgun cartridges on it. You'd put a finished cartridge on here to check its fit in the cylinder or chamber of a firearm. So there's going to be some of that going on here, and you're going to possibly feel a little bit of force as this goes up into the case, because that's the sizing that is occurring. However, this is turning freely even though the cartridge in its entirety is within the die, and you would lower this until you feel a distinct stop where it contacts the edge right there. It's hit the edge of the case. Now, at this point, where it's just at the edge of the case, were I to put all of these cartridges through here, all I would be doing is that final sizing of the case. And here's the 9mm here. That's a perfect fit for the chamber in a 9mm gun. However, I haven't done any crimping to it. Now, there's even directions in some of the manuals that say you don't need to crimp at this point. I like to put at least a modest amount of crimp on all of my ammunition, and in the case of the semi-autos, it has to be what's called a taper crimp, which is simply squeezing the case back to its original dimensions around the bullet. You don't ever want to roll this case because you don't want to take off this front edge, because that's where it actually seats. If you look in the chamber of a firearm, you can't see it in here, but there's a little ridge inside here that the front of the case actually stops on. That's what keeps it from going too far into the firearm, so you don't want to damage that case. So what we would do, and here's where this die is so repeatable. We've set it now so that it's exactly at the edge of the case. back the cartridge out. If you advance this 1/2 turn, you've imparted what we're going to call a light crimp. If you did it a full turn, you would impart what would be called a heavy crimp. We're going to put this in and we're done. This is exactly repeatable. Adjust the die to touching the shell holder, adjust this down to just touching the edge of the case, and then a 1/2 turn in. I could do that 1,000 times and the amount of crimp I was imparting would be exactly the same every time. Plus, we have the advantage of doing the final resizing of the entire finished cartridge in the die so that we know it's going to be the correct size for the chamber in the firearm. Now, you can't overdo this. All we're doing is confirming the size of the finished cartridge and confirming the amount of crimp that's on there. As long as we don't adjust that further, we're not going to put more crimp on this. So we're going to finish up these rounds, we're going to crimp the rest of them, then we'll proceed to the final video, which will be how to test your finished load at the range.